They were born into a world of unimaginable wealth and beauty, where chandeliers sparkled above marble floors and gold-trimmed halls echoed with music and laughter. Yet behind the walls of the Russian imperial palaces, for sisters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia Romanov, lived lives that were far more human than history often remembers. To the world, they were symbols of royalty, grace, and privilege. But to those who knew them, they were simply four young women growing up in a family that was both powerful and fragile, caught in the unstoppable tide of a revolution that would change history forever. The story of the Romanov sisters has long been overshadowed by myth and tragedy. Most people know the name Anastasia, the youngest and most mischievous of the four, whose supposed survival became one of the most famous mysteries of the 20th century. But behind the legend lies a deeper truth, a story not of ghosts or imposters, but of real people. These sisters were more than royal figures frozen in time. They laughed, quarreled, dreamed, and suffered just like anyone else. They loved deeply and remained devoted to one another until their final breath. Imagine growing up in the last days of Imperial Russia, surrounded by grandeur yet isolated from the outside world. The Romanov sisters spent their childhood between lavish ceremonies and quiet domestic life, their parents trying to shelter them from the growing unrest beyond the palace gates. Each sister had her own distinct spirit: Olga, the thoughtful dreamer; Tatiana, the graceful leader; Maria, the gentle heart; and Anastasia, the spirited rebel. Together, they formed an unbreakable bond that sustained them through every joy and sorrow. As the Russian Empire began to crumble, the sisters found themselves drawn from royal privilege into the harsh realities of a world at war. They worked as nurses, cared for wounded soldiers, and comforted the suffering. Their compassion shone through even as their father's empire fell apart. When the revolution finally came, the sisters faced their fate with a quiet courage that continues to move hearts today. This is not simply a story about royalty, it's a story about humanity. It's about the strength of family, the endurance of love, and the grace with which four young women faced the collapse of everything they had ever known. Behind every photograph of them smiling in their white dresses is a story of innocence meeting history's darkest hour. Their lives remind us that even in tragedy, there can be beauty, and that behind the legend, there are always real people whose voices still whisper across time. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we take you beyond the myth and into the real world of the Romanov sisters, the last daughters of the Russian Empire. Together, we'll explore who they truly were, how they lived, and how their legacy continues to move the world more than a century later. So stay with us as we uncover beyond the legend, the Romanov sisters. The story of the Romanov sisters begins in a world of splendor and ceremony, a world that glittered under the gold of imperial palaces and the hush of snow over endless Russian fields. Before the revolution tore through the empire, Russia stood as one of the grandest powers in the world, its court rivaling those of Europe in wealth, ritual, and deep tradition. The Romanovs ruled over millions, their reach stretching from the palaces of St. Petersburg to the villages of Siberia. At the heart of this immense realm stood Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, symbols of autocracy and devotion. Within the walls of their palace, behind the glitter of balls and the strict code of royal life, lived four young women whose lives would become both a symbol of innocence and a reflection of a vanishing age. To understand the Romanov sisters, one must first understand the world they inherited. Imperial Russia before the revolution was both dazzling and fragile. The capital city of St. Petersburg was filled with marble halls, chandeliers, and uniforms that caught the light of countless candles. The court followed a rhythm shaped by ceremony, with every movement of the Tsar and his family observed and recorded. The Romanovs lived in palaces surrounded by gardens, lakes, and forests. Their summers were spent in the quieter beauty of the countryside, where birch trees swayed in the wind and the scent of wildflowers filled the air. The splendor of their lives was real, yet it existed beside an empire struggling with hunger, unrest, and the weight of change. The royal family lived in a world apart, and their daughters grew up sheltered within it. The youngest of the four sisters, Anastasia, became the most famous after their deaths, largely because of the stories and legends that surrounded her name. The myth that she might have survived the massacre of her family took root almost as soon as the news of their deaths reached the outside world. For decades, rumors spread across Europe and America. Women came forward claiming to be Anastasia, each insisting she had escaped from the cellar in Ekaterinburg where the family met their end. Books were written, Films were made, and her name became a symbol of mystery and lost royalty. But this fascination, while powerful, often overshadowed the reality of who she truly was and who her sisters were. The four daughters of Nicholas and Alexandra were more than the tragic symbols history made of them. Each was a distinct person, shaped by her own strengths, weaknesses, and quiet dreams. The eldest sister, Olga, was born into expectation. As the first child of the Tsar and Tsarina, her birth was greeted with celebration across the empire. Yet behind the cheers and cannon salutes was a quiet disappointment that she was not a boy. Russia longed for an heir, and her arrival meant the wait would continue. Still, within the walls of the palace, Olga was cherished. She grew into a thoughtful and sensitive young woman, known for her intelligence and introspection. She read widely, loved poetry, and often wrote in her diary with a depth that revealed how aware she was of the world beyond the palace gates. Olga had a reflective nature, and though she shared in the laughter and mischief of her sisters, there was always a sense that she carried the weight of responsibility as the eldest. Her emotions were easily stirred, and she was known for moments of melancholy. Yet she could be bright and teasing, with a quick wit that made her siblings laugh. Those who knew her often described her eyes as gentle and searching, the eyes of a girl who saw and felt more than she said. Tatiana, the second sister, was quite different. Where Olga was emotional and dreamy, Tatiana was poised and disciplined. She was often called the governess by her siblings because of her orderly nature and her ability to take charge. She had an instinct for leadership and carried herself with the grace expected of a grand duchess. Tatiana was tall, elegant, and striking, with dark hair and a calm presence that made people listen when she spoke. Her mother, the empress, often relied on her, and Tatiana became her closest helper during the war years. She organized charity work, managed correspondence, and helped care for wounded soldiers when the family's palace was turned into a hospital. Beneath her composure, though, Tatiana was deeply sensitive. She had a quiet sense of duty that sometimes weighed heavily on her, but she rarely let it show. Her letters reveal a young woman who longed for love and stability, who dreamed of a future that would never come. Maria, the third sister, was often described as the most affectionate of the four. She had large, warm eyes and a sweetness that drew people to her. While Olga and Tatiana sometimes seemed distant or preoccupied with their thoughts, Maria's nature was open and sincere. She was deeply devoted to her family, especially her younger brother Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. She often cared for him with gentle patience, understanding the fragility of his health. Maria loved children and spoke often of wanting to marry a soldier and have a large family of her own. She was not as intellectual as Olga or as organized as Tatiana, but she possessed a kindness that left an impression on everyone she met. Her joy was simple and genuine. She loved painting, laughing, and spending long evenings talking with her sisters. When times grew dark, Maria's faith and warmth remained a comfort to the others. Anastasia, the youngest, was the spark that brought life into every room. She was spirited, mischievous, and often impossible to control. Her quick humor and playful defiance made her both loved and exasperating to those around her. She had a knack for mischief, often playing pranks on her tutors and hiding her sisters' belongings just to make them laugh. Yet behind her wild energy was a sharp mind and a strong will. She resisted the formalities of court life and disliked long ceremonies or lessons in etiquette. To her, laughter mattered more than rules. Still, her family adored her, and her humor often lightened the solemn atmosphere that surrounded their mother's fragile health and their brother's illness. Anastasia's charm lay in her authenticity. She was never polished or perfect, but her vitality made her unforgettable. Her story later became the focus of myth, but the real Anastasia was neither the lost princess of legend nor a fantasy of survival. She was a bright, impulsive girl whose life ended too soon. Together, the four sisters were known at court by the initials of their names, OTM and A, which their family often pronounced as OTMA. The four of them were rarely seen apart. Their bond was extraordinary, shaped by a childhood lived under constant scrutiny, yet full of shared jokes, games, and whispered secrets. They slept in adjoining rooms, wrote in matching diaries, and wore similar dresses sewn by the same hands. Their world was enclosed but not cold. They found joy in small things, sledding through snow-covered fields, tending to their pets, or taking photographs with the cameras their father had given them. Photography became one of their shared passions, and through the many images that survived, We can see them not as distant royals, but as young women full of laughter, posing with their dogs or walking barefoot through gardens. These photographs, informal and unguarded, reveal their humanity more than any royal portrait ever could. Their lives were marked by privilege, but they were not free in the way ordinary people imagine freedom. Every movement was guided by rules, every word measured by etiquette. The Empress, raised in the strict traditions of the German court, believed that her daughters should live modestly and with discipline. They slept on hard camp beds, took cold baths, and sewed and knitted clothes for charity. The Empress wanted them to understand duty, not luxury. Yet despite this austerity, the girls grew up in an atmosphere of love. Their parents, especially Nicholas, were affectionate and involved. The Tsar, often portrayed as distant in politics, was gentle and warm as a father. He joined in their games, took them on walks, and spent quiet evenings reading to them. In their family circle, the Romanovs were like any close family, bound by tenderness and shared faith. As they grew older, the sisters began to experience the tension between the private life they cherished and the public expectations they could not escape. They were admired by the Russian people, but also envied and misunderstood. Their mother's deep religious faith and her reliance on the mystic Grigory Rasputin caused whispers at court. His influence over the family became a source of scandal, and the girls, though innocent, were drawn into the shadow of that controversy. They saw in Rasputin not the figure of gossip, but a man who prayed for their brother's health and comforted their mother. They called him our friend and believed in his sincerity. Yet the growing unrest outside the palace walls was eroding the loyalty that once surrounded the throne. The sisters, raised to be gracious and kind, could not have fully understood the depth of the anger rising in the streets. When the First World War began, their sheltered lives changed forever. The empire was drawn into a conflict that would destroy it. The sisters, now young women, took on new roles. Olga and Tatiana, in particular, trained as nurses and worked in a military hospital within the palace grounds. They tended to wounded soldiers, washed bandages, and sat at the bedsides of men who had lost limbs or sight. For the first time, they saw suffering up close. The experience changed them. Tatiana's sense of duty deepened, and Olga's compassion grew more visible, though the horrors of war left her exhausted and disillusioned. Maria and Anastasia, too young to serve as nurses, helped by visiting the wounded and writing letters for them. These years of war stripped away much of the illusion of royal grandeur. The sisters saw their people's pain and responded with kindness, even as the empire around them began to collapse. The fall of the Romanov dynasty came not with sudden thunder, but with a slow unraveling. By the time the revolution reached its height, Nicholas had abdicated, and the family was placed under house arrest. The sisters, who had once walked through marble halls, now lived behind locked doors guarded by soldiers. Yet even in captivity, they remained dignified. They embroidered, read, and prayed together. They still joked and played games, trying to keep their spirits alive. Their closeness became their strength. When they were moved from one place of confinement to another, they carried few belongings, mostly books, letters, and small mementos. They did not complain. In their diaries, written during these final months, they spoke of hope, of faith, and of longing for normal life. There was little bitterness, only an acceptance that seemed beyond their years. The sisters' last days were spent in Ekaterinburg, in a house that had once belonged to a merchant. The grandeur of their childhood was gone, replaced by bare walls and the constant presence of guards. They were no longer royal daughters in the eyes of the world. They were prisoners of a new regime. Yet those who saw them during this time noted their calm and grace. They cared for their brother, who remained ill, and supported their parents with quiet devotion. Even in confinement, they continued to show kindness to those around them. When one of the guards fell ill, the sisters offered him tea and comforted him. Their upbringing had instilled in them not pride but humility, and it showed even at the end. What makes the story of the Romanov sisters so compelling is not only the tragedy of their deaths, but the light they carried within their short lives. Beyond the legend of Anastasia's supposed survival lies the truth of 4 young women who faced the world with courage and tenderness. They were born into a fading empire, raised amid the contradictions of immense privilege and deep isolation, and met their fate with grace. Their personalities, Olga's sensitivity, Tatiana's discipline, Maria's kindness, and Anastasia's spirited humor, each formed a different facet of a single, enduring bond. To look beyond the legend is to see them not as distant figures frozen in history, but as daughters, sisters, and young women who loved and dreamed as all people do. They lived in a time of beauty and upheaval, in a palace that stood as both a sanctuary and a cage. Their laughter once echoed through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, and their letters were filled with the same hopes that fill the hearts of young people everywhere: love, purpose, and belonging. The world around them changed too quickly for them to find these things, but their humanity endures in the fragments they left behind. The Romanov sisters were not just symbols of a lost dynasty. They were 4 lives intertwined, their story reminding us that history is made not only of rulers and wars, but of small moments of tenderness and strength. In the photographs that survive, we can still see them smiling, unaware of what fate would bring. Beyond the myth of Anastasia, beyond the grandeur of Imperial Russia, there remain the faces of Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. For young women whose light still shines across the years, speaking not of legend but of life. The lives of Olga and Tatiana, the 2 eldest Romanov sisters, cannot be separated from the world that shaped them, nor from the quiet burdens they carried beneath their polished appearances. Their existence was one of both privilege and restriction, a constant balancing act between duty and the quiet ache for a normal life that could never be theirs. To understand them is to look beyond the surface of royal photographs and portraits, to see the subtle signs of weariness in their expressions, the gentle defiance in their letters, and the tenderness that held their family together as the empire began to crumble. Olga Nikolaevna, the firstborn daughter of the last Tsar, entered the world as both a blessing and a disappointment. The empire celebrated the arrival of a child, but the lack of a male heir left an unspoken sadness that her parents could not entirely hide. Despite this, Nicholas and Alexandra adored their daughter. From her earliest years, Olga revealed a depth of thought and emotion that set her apart. Her eyes, described by many as blue and reflective, seemed to hold an awareness that went beyond her years. She was often quiet, but not because she lacked spirit. Her silence carried a kind of thoughtfulness, as if she were always listening for something just beyond reach. Olga's tutors noticed her sharp mind early. She loved literature, poetry, and languages, and she excelled in her studies when the lessons interested her. Yet she was never drawn to the rigid structure of royal education. While other children of nobility learned to present themselves with practiced charm, Olga struggled with the idea of pretense. She was open and sincere, unable to hide her feelings when she disagreed with authority. This honesty sometimes caused friction with her mother, who valued obedience and composure. Alexandra saw in Olga the soul of a dreamer, someone who might one day struggle to accept the sacrifices that royal life demanded. She was right. Olga longed for something simpler, a life untouched by court politics or ceremonial duties. She spoke often of wanting to live quietly, perhaps in the countryside, where she could write, read, and raise a family. As the eldest, she felt the weight of example. Her younger sisters looked to her, and though she loved them deeply, she sometimes felt trapped by the need to be strong for everyone else. Her nature was tender but restless. Those who knew her well noticed moments when she would withdraw from laughter and chatter, sitting by herself with a faraway look. In her letters, she confessed feelings of melancholy that she could not fully explain. She wrote of the strain of public life, of the exhaustion that came from always being watched, and of the sorrow she felt for those who suffered outside the palace walls. Her empathy was genuine, and it grew stronger as she matured. When the war began, Olga's compassion found expression in service. Along with her sister Tatiana, she trained as a nurse and began tending to wounded soldiers in a hospital established within the palace grounds. For the first time, she stepped beyond the sheltered routines of royal life and into a world of pain, courage, and mortality. The sight of blood, the sound of groans, and the constant presence of death left deep marks on her heart. She learned to clean wounds, write letters for soldiers who could no longer hold a pen, and comfort dying men who clutched small icons in their trembling hands. She worked long hours, her delicate hands covered with gloves to hide the calluses that formed from constant labor. This period of her life revealed both her strength and her fragility. Olga gave herself completely to her duties, yet the suffering she witnessed drained her. Her letters from the time show a woman struggling between compassion and despair. She often spoke of how the soldiers' courage moved her to tears, but also of how their pain haunted her dreams. The endless faces of those broken by war seemed to mirror her own growing disillusionment with the world she had once believed in. The royal family, so long separated from the lives of ordinary people, was beginning to feel the consequences of decisions made far beyond the sisters' control. Olga saw the world around her unraveling, and it broke something inside her gentle heart. If Olga was the dreamer, Tatiana Nikolaevna was the one who turned dreams into order. The second sister stood beside her elder sibling in almost every way, yet she was her contrast in temperament. Where Olga was open and emotional, Tatiana was disciplined and composed. She was tall, graceful, and carried herself with a quiet authority that made people listen when she spoke. Her beauty was often remarked upon at court. She had dark hair, striking eyes, and an air of calm that made her seem older than she was. Her composure was not simply a matter of training. It was part of who she was. She had a deep sense of duty and believed that every task, no matter how small, should be done with care. Tatiana's role within the family was often that of mediator. She had a gift for organization and could handle difficult situations with patience and tact. Her sisters nicknamed her the governess because of her tendency to take charge when things became chaotic. She made sure that lessons were completed, letters written, and responsibilities fulfilled. Their mother, often in fragile health, relied heavily on her. Alexandra saw in Tatiana a reflection of herself, pious, reserved, and deeply loyal. Their bond was strong, and it only deepened during the war years when the Empress's anxiety grew under the pressures of illness, isolation, and political turmoil. Like Olga, Tatiana took on the role of nurse during the war. She was methodical and tireless, moving from bed to bed with quiet competence. She wrote letters for soldiers who could no longer see, listened to their stories, and whispered prayers over their wounds. The doctors who worked beside her were surprised by her endurance. She could work for hours without complaint, and even when she was exhausted, she carried herself with dignity. Her devotion to her patients earned her the respect of everyone in the hospital. Many soldiers said that her presence alone was enough to ease their pain, that her calm voice and gentle hands gave them comfort in their darkest moments. She was the image of compassion and control. But Tatiana's strength came at a cost. She rarely allowed herself to express the emotions that weighed on her. While Olga wept openly, Tatiana kept her feelings hidden. She was the protector, the one who held the family together when others faltered. Her diaries reveal a young woman struggling to balance faith and fear, love and duty. She wrote of her longing for peace, of her desire to do good, and of her quiet hopes for the future. In one entry, she confessed her wish to marry a man who would serve his country honorably, but she also knew that her position as a Grand Duchess made such dreams unlikely. The war had narrowed the possibilities of her life even further. She could no longer imagine herself apart from her family's fate. Both sisters were drawn deeply into their mother's world of prayer and dependence on faith. Alexandra, haunted by her son Alexei's illness, found solace in religion and in the guidance of Grigory Rasputin. Olga and Tatiana stood by her, defending her against criticism and misunderstanding. To them, Rasputin was not the scandalous figure described in the newspapers, but a man who had helped ease their mother's suffering, and in their eyes, saved their brother's life more than once. The growing hostility toward Rasputin pained them deeply, and the public's contempt for their mother's faith only isolated the family further. Within the palace, faith became both a comfort and a wall, separating them from the world outside. As the years of war dragged on, the strain began to show. Olga's spirit, once so full of quiet strength, grew weary. She suffered from exhaustion and depression, though she tried to hide it. She found solace in music, books, and the company of her sisters, but the shadow of hopelessness often returned. Her father's abdication, the loss of the monarchy, and the hatred that now surrounded their family left her disoriented. She still believed in the goodness of people, but she could no longer understand how that goodness could coexist with so much cruelty. Her health declined, and her once bright eyes took on a distant look, as if she were already preparing to let go of the world that had betrayed her ideals. Tatiana, on the other hand, responded to the collapse of their world with quiet resilience. She maintained routines, cared for her family, and continued to pray. She encouraged her sisters to stay hopeful, even when there seemed little reason to be. Her sense of order gave her strength, but it also kept her from expressing the pain that must have burned inside her. In the letters written during their captivity, Tatiana's tone is calm and measured. She writes of small things, the weather, the books they are reading, the health of her siblings. But beneath the surface, one senses a woman holding herself together by sheer will. She refused to give in to despair because she knew her mother and father depended on her. The relationship between the two sisters deepened during these final years. They had always been close, but captivity made their bond unbreakable. They shared whispered conversations in the quiet of the night, memories of their happier days, and dreams of freedom that became increasingly faint. Olga leaned on Tatiana's steadiness, while Tatiana drew strength from Olga's empathy. Together they became the emotional core of the family, supporting their parents and guiding their younger sisters through fear and uncertainty. Even the guards noticed their composure. Though they were prisoners, they carried themselves with the same dignity they had shown in the palace, as if their inner nobility could not be taken from them. Their personal struggles during this time reveal much about their characters. Olga's rebellion was quiet but real. She questioned the meaning of their suffering and wondered whether their lives had been too separated from the people they were meant to serve. She spoke openly of forgiveness and faith, yet she also admitted to feeling anger and confusion. She wanted to believe that their ordeal had purpose, but the silence of God during those dark months weighed heavily on her heart. Her spiritual struggle was not one of loss of belief, but of trying to reconcile faith with pain. In contrast, Tatiana's faith remained unshaken. Her letters show a serenity that seems almost supernatural. She accepted their circumstances as God's will and encouraged her family to do the same. It was not resignation but trust, a belief that even in suffering, there was meaning. Their wartime service had prepared them for sacrifice, though they could not have known how far that sacrifice would go. The lessons they learned in the hospital, compassion, endurance, humility, became their guide during imprisonment. They tended to their brother when his illness flared, cared for their mother when she was weak, and tried to keep the household orderly even as their guards grew harsher. They still took time to sew, read, and celebrate small occasions. On Easter, they painted eggs as they had in happier times, sharing them with the soldiers who watched over them. These small acts of grace gave their lives dignity when everything else was stripped away. In their final months, Olga's quiet rebellion softened into acceptance, and Tatiana's discipline deepened into serenity. They wrote letters to friends expressing gratitude rather than bitterness. They thanked people who had sent them books or small gifts, never revealing the hardship they endured. Their words were full of gentleness and faith. Even when they were moved to Ekaterinburg, where they would face their deaths, they remained composed. The sisters stayed close, comforting one another, whispering prayers, and holding hands when fear crept in. They had been raised to serve, and in the end, they served each other, with love, courage, and unwavering loyalty. To speak of Olga and Tatiana is to speak of grace under pressure, of two young women who faced the collapse of their world not with resentment, but with quiet strength. They were witnesses to the end of an empire and participants in a tragedy that would echo across the century. Yet their legacy is not only of loss. It is also of compassion, intellect, and faith. Olga's sensitivity reminds us of the power of empathy, even in despair, while Tatiana's discipline shows the dignity that comes from duty and love. They lived as daughters of a czar, but they died as examples of what it means to face suffering with humanity. Their unseen roles in history were not written in grand deeds or political acts, but in the quiet constancy with which they lived their lives. They brought comfort to the wounded, steadiness to their family, and light to each other. In the shadow of the revolution, when the grandeur of their past had turned to dust, they revealed the truest measure of nobility: kindness, courage, and faith that did not waver when the world fell apart. Beyond the myths and the sorrow, Olga and Tatiana remain not as relics of monarchy, but as human beings whose strength was found not in power but in love. After Olga and Tatiana, whose sense of duty and strength guided the family through the war and into captivity, came Maria Nikolaevna, the third daughter, whose gentle heart and quiet warmth held the family together in ways often overlooked by history. Maria's story is not one of rebellion or leadership, but of kindness so sincere that it shone even in darkness. Her nature was simple, open, and full of love. She did not question the world as deeply as Olga did, nor command it with the poise of Tatiana, but she had something just as valuable: a tenderness that made people feel seen and cared for. She was the soft voice in the room, the steady hand on a shoulder, the one who smiled even when her own heart was heavy. From her earliest days, Maria's sweetness was her defining trait. Her blue eyes, often described as luminous, gave her a look of innocence that drew others to her. Courtiers, servants, and tutors all spoke of her gentleness. She was neither as mischievous as her younger sister nor as thoughtful as her older ones, but she possessed a sincerity that made her beloved by all who knew her. Those who met her often commented that she seemed older than her years, not because of wisdom or intellect, but because of her emotional understanding. She had an instinct for comfort. When someone was sad or troubled, Maria was the one who would quietly take their hand and sit beside them without a word. That gift of presence, simple and profound, would become her greatest strength in the years of sorrow that lay ahead. In the palace, Maria grew up surrounded by the same routines and restrictions that shaped all the Romanov children. Her life followed a rhythm of lessons, prayers, and carefully arranged outings. Yet within that structure, she found joy in the small moments that made her world feel human. She loved painting and drawing, often sketching scenes from the gardens or portraits of her siblings. She was drawn to beauty in ordinary things, the way sunlight fell through lace curtains, or how snow sparkled on the frozen river outside the palace windows. Her sense of wonder was childlike, yet it carried a depth of feeling that came from genuine gratitude. While her older sisters often struggled with the expectations of royal life, Maria accepted them with quiet grace. She did not question the rules that confined her. Her obedience came not from submission, but from love. She adored her parents and saw it as her duty to make their lives easier. When her mother's health failed, Maria stayed by her side for hours, reading aloud or simply holding her hand. When her father faced the growing pressures of rule, she offered him warmth and affection without judgment. Her faith in her family was unshakable. To her, they were not symbols of empire, but the people she loved most in the world. Her compassion extended to her younger brother, Alexei, whose illness cast a long shadow over their childhood. Maria, more than any of the others, had the patience to care for him during his worst attacks. She could spend hours sitting beside him, telling stories or singing softly to distract him from pain. Her gentle voice soothed him when no one else could. The family's fear of his bleeding condition was constant, but Maria's calm presence often brought peace to those tense moments. She seemed to carry within her a natural understanding of suffering, as if she had been born with the ability to ease it simply by being near. Yet her tenderness was not without cost. Maria's heart was open to everyone, and in that openness lay a vulnerability that made her pain more profound when the world turned cruel. The adoration she gave to others often came back to her in disappointment. She longed deeply for affection, and as she grew older, that longing became one of the central parts of her life. Her dreams were not of crowns or power, but of family and love. She once confided to a friend that she wanted to marry a soldier, a man brave and kind, someone who would love her for who she was, not for her title. She imagined a home filled with laughter and children, a life grounded in the simple joys she had always cherished. But such dreams, tender and ordinary, were beyond her reach. Even in her teenage years, Maria's yearning for connection could be seen in her interactions with the soldiers and attendants around her. She was known for her friendliness, for speaking to guards with kindness when others passed them by. Her warmth was not flirtation but genuine care, though it was sometimes misunderstood. In a world divided by class and hierarchy, her compassion blurred lines that others insisted should remain clear. Yet she could not help it. Her nature resisted the cold distance that royal life demanded. Her heart was too large, and her belief in the goodness of people too strong. That same openness that made her beloved also made her fragile when the walls of her world began to fall. During the war, Maria's role was quieter than that of her older sisters, but no less important. Too young to train as a nurse, she helped in whatever ways she could, writing letters for the wounded, visiting the hospital wards, bringing flowers to brighten rooms that smelled of medicine and blood. She listened to stories of soldiers far from home and spoke to them as if they were old friends. Many wrote to her afterward, thanking her for her kindness. She brought light into places where hope was fading, not through words of inspiration, but through simple acts of humanity. She was the embodiment of comfort in an age of suffering. Her beauty became the subject of quiet admiration among those who saw her at the hospital or during rare public appearances. She had inherited her mother's delicate features, but carried them with a natural ease that seemed untouched by vanity. Her smile, soft and genuine, gave her a warmth that set her apart even in a family known for grace. Yet Maria never sought admiration. Compliments embarrassed her. When someone praised her appearance, she would blush and look away, unsure how to respond. Her humility was as much a part of her as her beauty. The war years, however, changed her. The cheerful girl who once filled rooms with laughter began to carry a deeper sadness. She saw how the conflict drained her father, and how her mother's anxiety grew heavier with every passing month. She understood more than her parents realized. Though they tried to shield their daughters from political realities, Maria could not ignore the tension that hung over their home. The news from the front grew worse, and letters from the wounded carried stories of despair. She prayed daily for peace, kneeling beside her sisters, whispering the same pleas over and over until her faith itself began to tremble beneath the weight of unanswered prayers. As the empire weakened, isolation closed around the family. Public admiration turned to resentment, and the walls of the palace became both their refuge and their prison. Maria felt the change keenly. She could not comprehend why the people who once cheered for them now spoke with anger and bitterness. Her heart, always inclined toward love, struggled to understand hatred. She began to sense that their titles, once a source of honor, had become chains. Her letters during this time show her confusion and sorrow. She wrote of missing simple interactions with people, of longing to walk through the streets freely, to speak to children, to visit churches without guards. The simplicity she once dreamed of now seemed like paradise. Through the growing turmoil, Maria remained a source of comfort for her family. When tensions rose, it was she who diffused them with a smile or a quiet word. Her father often called her his joy, a name that captured how her presence lifted the gloom that often hung over their household. Even when her sisters quarreled, she played the peacemaker. Her patience seemed endless. Tatiana's perfectionism and Olga's melancholy sometimes clashed, but Maria's kindness bridged the gap. She reminded them of laughter when they had forgotten it. Her empathy extended even to the servants, whose loyalty during those difficult years never wavered. To them, she was not a distant duchess, but a girl with a warm heart who noticed when someone was tired or sad. Yet beneath her gentleness lay an unspoken sorrow. Maria's dreams of love and family, so vivid in her youth, grew more distant as the revolution unfolded. She was old enough to understand what was happening, but still young enough to hope it might somehow end differently. When the family was placed under house arrest, she adjusted with quiet acceptance. She spent her days sewing, reading, and helping her mother. She still found joy in small things, the song of a bird outside the window, the sound of her brother's laughter, the rare moments when her father's smile returned. Her faith remained strong, though it was tested by the monotony and fear of captivity. During their imprisonment, Maria's compassion extended even to their captors. She spoke kindly to the soldiers assigned to guard them, not out of defiance, but from a refusal to let bitterness take root in her heart. Some guards, moved by her kindness, softened toward the family. Her ability to see humanity, even in those who held them prisoner, showed the purity of her spirit. But this same gentleness also brought her sorrow. She could not harden herself to the cruelty and injustice that surrounded them. Her empathy, which had always been her strength, became her burden. She felt others' pain too deeply to protect herself from it. As the months passed, Maria's longing for freedom turned inward. She began to dream less of the world beyond their confinement and more of inner peace. She prayed for strength for her family, especially for her mother, whose health continued to decline. She took on the role of comforter with quiet dignity. When her sisters' moods darkened, she told stories or made small jokes to ease their sadness. Even Anastasia, whose restless energy often filled their rooms with laughter or chaos, found in Maria a gentle balance. The bond between the sisters grew even stronger in those final years, and Maria's steady presence was its heart. There was a quiet heroism in her acceptance. She never complained, never railed against fate. Her patience came from a deep faith that love and goodness still mattered, even when everything around her suggested otherwise. When the family was moved to Ekaterinburg, she tried to make the best of the bleak surroundings. She helped clean, organize their few possessions, and continued to care for her brother. To the end, she believed that kindness had meaning. It was her way of resisting despair. The contrast between Maria's innocent hopes and the reality that closed in on her is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of her story. She had dreamed of a home filled with laughter, of children running through gardens, of sunlight and peace. Instead, her last years were marked by confinement, fear, and loss. Yet even within that narrow space, her goodness endured. Her faith did not depend on circumstance. It came from within. She remained true to herself, the same gentle soul who once painted flowers in the palace garden. Her love for her family never wavered, and in their final moments together, she continued to offer comfort. Maria's life, though short, stands as a quiet testament to the power of kindness. She did not shape history through action or ambition. Her influence was not one of command, but of presence. She reminded those around her that compassion can exist even in the darkest times, that innocence and grace can survive even in the face of despair. The simplicity of her dreams, the wish to love and be loved, makes her story all the more tragic, for those were dreams every human heart can understand. In her, the spirit of the Romanov sisters reached its most tender expression. Olga brought thought, Tatiana brought discipline, Anastasia brought energy, but Maria brought warmth, the kind of warmth that binds a family together. When the world outside their walls turned to chaos, she remained a light in their midst, soft yet steady. Her story does not need embellishment or legend. It needs only to be remembered as it was. The life of a young woman whose gentle heart shone even as the storm closed in. The empire that once seemed eternal vanished, but Maria's quiet grace endures in the memory of those who look beyond the myths. Her kindness was not lost in the noise of history. It lingers in the letters she wrote, in the testimonies of those who knew her, and in the rare photographs where her eyes seem to hold both innocence and understanding. She reminds us that even in the shadow of great tragedy, the simplest virtues, love, compassion, and faith, remain the most powerful. Maria Nikolaevna Romanova lived a life measured not in years or accomplishments, but in the goodness she gave to others. Her story, woven into that of her sisters, completes the picture of a family whose humanity outshines their royal titles. Beyond the grandeur of their birth and the horror of their end, there remains the image of a young woman who dreamed of love, who comforted those around her, and who met her fate with courage and grace. Her gentle heart may have gone unfulfilled in this world, but in the story of the Romanovs, it continues to beat softly, reminding us of what endures when everything else fades. The story of the Romanov sisters cannot be told in fragments, because their lives were bound together by love that seemed to exist beyond time, beyond the walls of palaces, and even beyond the tragedy that would one day claim them. To understand one of them fully, one must see all four together, for it was only in each other's company that they were truly complete. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, known collectively as OTMA, were not merely sisters by birth. They were companions in every joy and sorrow that life offered them. The bond they shared was their greatest gift, and in the end, their greatest comfort. They grew up in a world of order and expectation, where every movement was observed and every word mattered. Yet within those rigid boundaries, they carved out a secret universe of their own. It was a world filled with laughter, whispers, and the kind of love that only siblings who have shared every moment of life can understand. From the grand halls of the Alexander Palace to the quiet corners of their rooms, the four sisters were inseparable. They rose together in the mornings, prayed together, studied side by side, and spent their evenings reading, sewing, or playing games. Their rooms were simple compared to the splendor of the empire around them. Plain furniture, framed photographs, and walls lined with icons and small mementos. What made those rooms come alive was not the decoration, but the warmth of the people within them. Olga, the eldest, was thoughtful and introspective, often serving as the moral center of the group. Tatiana was the organizer, calm and precise, the one who could bring order to chaos. Maria, with her soft heart, was the peacemaker, always ready to comfort anyone who was upset. Anastasia, the youngest, was the spark that ignited their laughter, mischievous and impulsive, forever challenging rules just to see how far she could go. Together, they formed a perfect balance, each one filling the spaces left by the others. If one was quiet, another would sing. If one was discouraged, another would bring cheer. It was as if they had been created to hold each other up. The sisters shared everything. They wore dresses made from the same fabrics, often designed to look nearly identical except for small differences in color or ribbon. They called themselves by their initials, OTMA, a private symbol that represented their unity. They even created their own language of nicknames and inside jokes, a secret code that no one outside their circle could understand. To outsiders, it might have seemed childish, but for them, it was a way to build a space that belonged only to them, separate from the formality of court life. In letters and diaries, they used these private nicknames affectionately, blending humor with tenderness. Their closeness was not only emotional, but also physical. They often slept in adjoining rooms, leaving the doors open so they could whisper to each other late into the night. Their childhood was filled with moments of simple happiness that seem almost ordinary compared to the grandeur of their surroundings. They played games in the gardens, slid down stair railings, and built snowmen during long winters. Their laughter echoed through marble corridors, softening the coldness of the palace. The servants adored them for their kindness and lack of arrogance. The sisters treated everyone with respect, addressing maids and attendants with warmth that defied the rigid lines of class that defined their world. They never saw themselves as distant royals, but as people who could love and be loved. Yet, as they grew older, their bond deepened into something more profound than childhood closeness. The pressures of public life, their mother's ill health, and their brother's fragile condition created a shared sense of responsibility that united them. They learned early that their lives were not entirely their own. The court expected perfection, the public expected grace, and their parents expected obedience. Within those expectations, the sisters found refuge in each other. When one felt suffocated by the weight of duty, the others provided release through humor, affection, and understanding. Like any sisters, they quarreled, sometimes fiercely, but their disagreements never lasted long. Olga's sensitivity occasionally clashed with Anastasia's mischief. Tatiana's insistence on order could irritate the others, especially when she acted like a second mother. Maria's desire to keep peace sometimes made her seem indecisive. But their fights were like passing storms, intense but brief. Apologies always followed, often in the form of a shared laugh or a simple gesture. They had learned that their love mattered more than their pride. Their diaries reveal the depth of their connection. They wrote about one another with affection and humor, often poking fun at themselves and their siblings. Olga teased Tatiana for being too serious. Tatiana scolded Anastasia for her antics, but admitted she could never stay angry with her. Maria expressed admiration for all her sisters, and Anastasia, though the youngest, often claimed to be the wisest, making them laugh even when tears were close. Their private writings are filled with moments of humanity. A joke shared over tea, a complaint about the weather, or the excitement of receiving a new book. It is in these small details that their sisterhood becomes real, not as an idea or legend, but as a living, breathing relationship. As they entered adolescence, the differences in their personalities became clearer, yet those differences only made their bond stronger. Olga became more reflective, questioning life and the meaning of faith. Tatiana grew more disciplined, taking on the role of caretaker, particularly for their mother. Maria's innocence remained, but her sense of empathy deepened, allowing her to connect with each sister in her own way. Anastasia remained unpredictable and full of energy, often playing pranks to break the tension of solemn days. Each brought something the others needed. Without Olga's insight, they might have lost their sense of purpose. Without Tatiana's control, they might have fallen into chaos. Without Maria's compassion, they might have become hardened by duty. Without Anastasia's laughter, they might have forgotten how to smile. Their unity was tested when war came. The world outside their palace changed in ways they could scarcely comprehend. The empire their father ruled began to crack, and with it, their protected life began to fade. The sisters turned to each other for strength as their family faced the growing crisis. Olga and Tatiana became nurses, working long hours in the hospital, while Maria and Anastasia visited the wounded, bringing small gifts and kind words. They saw horrors that no young women of their upbringing were meant to witness. Men broken by battle, faces scarred, bodies crippled. Yet even in those grim surroundings, their closeness sustained them. They shared every experience, comforting each other after long days in the wards. When Olga grew quiet with sorrow, Anastasia would tell stories to make her smile. When Tatiana became weary, Maria would bring her tea or brush her hair to calm her nerves. The war stripped away much of their innocence, but it also revealed their character. They found purpose not in their titles, but in their service to others. In the hospital, there were no crowns or privileges, only work, pain, and compassion. The sisters wore plain uniforms, their royal jewels replaced by crosses and bandages. They learned the humility of labor and the value of endurance. Yet even amid the suffering, they found moments of joy. They sang to cheer the soldiers, celebrated small birthdays with homemade cakes, and exchanged smiles that reminded everyone there was still beauty in the world. As the war dragged on, the sisters became increasingly aware of the tension building around them. The empire was faltering, and whispers of revolution reached even the palace walls. Their father's decisions were criticized, their mother's faith was mocked, and their family's once adored image began to crumble. Through it all, the four sisters stood as one. They defended their parents fiercely and comforted them in private. Their shared sense of loyalty became their shield. When public hostility turned to danger, that bond transformed into quiet courage. Their unity was no longer just a matter of affection, it became survival. When they were placed under house arrest, the sisters faced the loss of freedom with remarkable calm. They turned their captivity into a new rhythm of life, maintaining order through small rituals. They still prayed together, read aloud, and helped their mother sew. They found strength in routine, but even more in each other. They could endure confinement because they were together. Their closeness became their last defense against despair. Inside the walls that confined them, they created a world that no guards could touch. They celebrated birthdays, made jokes about their situation, and found small ways to keep hope alive. They played cards, read aloud from favorite books, and sang softly in the evenings. Their humor often masked fear, but it also kept them human. When one of them fell into sadness, the others lifted her. They took turns being strong, never letting any single one carry the burden alone. It was as if the love between them created a quiet light that the harshness of their surroundings could not extinguish. Even the guards, hardened by duty, noticed the sisters' bond. They saw how they moved as one, how they shared everything without complaint. When food was scarce, they divided it equally. When one fell ill, the others stayed by her side. They never fought or blamed each other, even in moments of frustration. Their unity was a quiet act of resistance, a refusal to let the cruelty of their situation strip them of dignity or affection. Their bond extended beyond words. They could communicate with a glance, a touch, a shared smile. Years of growing up together in such close quarters had given them a near telepathic understanding of one another. In captivity, this unspoken connection became essential. They knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to comfort and when to distract. Each gesture carried meaning, a squeeze of the hand, a shared look during prayer, a faint smile across the room. When their world shrank to a few rooms under constant watch, their love became the only freedom left to them. They no longer had the luxury of planning for the future, so they lived for each other in the present. In letters smuggled to friends, they wrote not of despair but of gratitude for being together. They spoke of small joys, sunlight through a window, the sound of rain, the laughter that still found them even in the most unlikely moments. Their unity was a living thing, fragile yet unbreakable. The sisters' bond was also their parents' comfort. Nicholas and Alexandra, burdened with guilt and fear, leaned on their daughter's strength. The girls never allowed their parents to see their despair. They hid their own fears to spare them pain. The sight of the four sisters together, still smiling, gave their parents hope. The Empress often said that her daughters were her greatest blessing, her proof that love could endure even in sorrow. In the final months, when the family was moved to the house in Ekaterinburg, their closeness reached its most profound expression. Surrounded by hostility and uncertainty, the sisters clung to one another with unwavering devotion. They spent every waking hour together, reading prayers, caring for their brother, and comforting their parents. The fear that had once lived in silence became a shared courage. They spoke little of escape or rescue. Instead, they focused on what they could control, the love they gave each other and the grace with which they faced each day. Even as the shadow of death grew closer, their unity never faltered. The accounts of those who saw them in those final weeks speak of calmness, of dignity that seemed almost otherworldly. They laughed softly, whispered to each other in the quiet of the night, and took comfort in holding hands when fear became too heavy. Their love was their final prayer, the last echo of their shared life. The legacy of OTMA is not only one of tragedy, but of sisterhood at its purest. Their lives remind us that even in the darkest times, human connection can endure. They were born into unimaginable privilege and died as prisoners, but in both circumstances, they remained the same, kind, loyal, and inseparable. Their closeness was not simply a byproduct of upbringing, but a deliberate choice, reaffirmed every day through compassion and understanding. The photographs that survive of them, laughing in gardens, sitting close together, or leaning against each other, capture more than beauty. They capture the essence of their bond. They show four young women whose love for one another was stronger than fear, stronger than the empire that fell around them, and stronger even than death. In those images, their eyes tell a story of connection that no distance of time can erase. The sisters' united front was not an act of defiance, but an act of love. It was their way of saying to the world that even when everything else is taken away, love remains. In a world collapsing around them, they chose loyalty over despair, faith over fear, and affection over bitterness. Their shared strength became a quiet symbol of grace under impossible circumstances. Olga's wisdom, Tatiana's steadiness, Maria's kindness, and Anastasia's joy came together like four notes in a single chord, creating harmony that outlasted the noise of history. Their bond, so intimate and genuine, remains one of the most moving aspects of their story. In the end, it was not palaces, jewels, or titles that defined them, but the simple, profound truth of their love for one another. That love, untouched by time, continues to remind the world that even in its darkest chapters, humanity can still shine through. The story of the Romanov sisters, which had been filled with laughter, devotion, and quiet endurance, reached its darkest chapter in the months that followed their captivity. The palace halls that had once echoed with their voices were replaced by locked doors, armed guards, and the heavy silence of fear. Yet even in those final days, when all that was familiar was stripped away, the four sisters and their family carried themselves with a grace that defied the cruelty surrounding them. Their bond, which had been their strength in happier times, became their shield in suffering. What makes their story so haunting is not only how it ended, but how they lived until the very end, still kind, still hopeful, still human. Their imprisonment began quietly. At first, the restrictions felt temporary, a precaution that might soon be lifted. They had been told that their father's abdication was necessary, that peace would return, and that their family would be allowed to live in quiet retirement. The sisters believed it because they wanted to believe it. The war had drained the country, their father's rule had ended, and it seemed reasonable to hope for a private life far from politics. But hope soon gave way to a slow, dawning realization. The guards changed, the tone of the officials grew colder, and the familiar comforts began to disappear one by one. Letters were censored or never delivered. Friends vanished. The freedom to walk in gardens or attend church was taken from them. Their world shrank to a few rooms, and the walls around them began to feel like the borders of another kind of prison, the kind made not only of bricks but of fear. The sisters adapted as best they could. Olga and Tatiana continued to maintain structure in their days, organizing prayers, lessons, and small household duties to keep everyone occupied. Maria tried to lift spirits with her gentle humor, while Anastasia turned even the bleakest moments into small acts of rebellion. She played jokes on the guards, teased her siblings, and found ways to make them laugh when despair threatened to settle in. Their laughter was not careless. It was a form of courage, a way to hold on to life when the world around them seemed determined to erase it. Their parents did their best to protect them from the truth, though the sisters were not naive. They sensed the rising hatred outside the walls. They heard fragments of conversation from guards, whispers about riots and soldiers refusing orders. Olga, always the most introspective, understood more than she admitted. She wrote in her diary that she was praying for strength and that she hoped they could all remain patient and kind, even toward those who despised them. Her words carried no anger, only sorrow and resignation. Tatiana's diary, by contrast, showed her effort to maintain faith in divine will. She recorded the small routines that gave them a sense of normalcy, prayers, family meals, the care of their brother Alexei, perhaps as a way to remind herself that life, no matter how confined, still had order. Maria's kindness continued to touch even those assigned to guard her. Several guards would later recall her gentleness, her quiet gratitude for small favors, and her ability to make even the most hardened soldier lower his guard. There were moments when she tried to converse with them, asking about their families or thanking them for their work. It was not an act of manipulation, but of instinctive compassion. She could not bear to see bitterness or cruelty, and she believed kindness could still make a difference. Anastasia, restless and full of emotion, found it harder to contain her frustration. Her youthful energy clashed with confinement. She longed for open fields, for laughter that was not forced, for sunlight that did not filter through barred windows. Yet even she learned to find strength in small acts of love, helping her brother, singing softly to cheer her sisters, and writing letters that she knew might never be sent. As the months passed, the conditions worsened. The family was moved to a new location, further from the capital, where the sense of isolation deepened. The journey itself was harsh. They were transported under guard, watched constantly, denied privacy, and often treated with indifference or contempt. When they arrived at their final destination, a modest house in a distant city, they knew their lives would never return to what they had been. The windows were painted over, blocking their view of the outside world. Their once lavish meals were replaced with simple, sometimes meager food. They were forbidden from leaving the yard, and even their conversations were monitored. Despite the bleakness, the sisters made every effort to preserve dignity. They still rose early, made their beds neatly, and helped their mother care for Alexei. They continued their prayers, marking the holy days even when there were no priests to lead them. They embroidered, read aloud, and found joy in the smallest things: a bird landing near the window, the sound of distant rain, a moment of shared laughter. To anyone watching, they might have appeared calm, but beneath that calm lay a growing sense of foreboding. It is difficult to imagine what went through their minds in those final weeks. They were young, Olga in her early 20s, Tatiana barely younger, Maria and Anastasia still teenagers, but they had seen the world collapse around them. They had lost not only their freedom but their country, their home, and the faith of the people their family once ruled. Yet even as despair grew, their writings and actions show no trace of bitterness. They did not curse their fate or the men who confined them. Instead, they prayed for their captors and for Russia itself. Their faith, which had once been a source of comfort, now became their only anchor. The sense of doom was not sudden. It crept upon them like a slow-moving shadow. The sisters began to notice changes in the guards' behavior: more tension, more secrecy, a strange quiet that filled the air. Their parents tried to reassure them, insisting that everything was under control, but even Nicholas and Alexandra must have sensed the truth. Rumors had reached them that their safety could no longer be guaranteed. The revolution that had begun with promises of freedom had turned into chaos, and in that chaos, the family that had once symbolized power became symbols of hatred and vengeance. When the final order came, it was delivered in secrecy. The family was told that they would be moved again, supposedly to a safer location. They gathered their belongings quietly, packing what little they had left. The sisters, obedient as always, dressed neatly and prepared themselves for another journey. They carried small tokens, crosses, lockets, letters, and a few pieces of jewelry sewn discreetly into their clothing, more as keepsakes than valuables. They had no reason to suspect that the journey would never take place. That night, they were awakened and told to come downstairs. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with unease. The sisters stood close to one another, as they always did when they were afraid. Their parents were calm, trying to set an example of courage. What followed remains one of the most tragic moments in modern history, a moment that ended not just a family, but an entire chapter of a nation's identity. Their deaths have often been described in political terms, as an act of revolution, vengeance, or necessity. Yet to focus only on the politics is to miss the true weight of what was lost. In that small, confined room, 7 human beings faced the end of their lives, people who had loved, laughed, prayed, and suffered like anyone else. The Romanov sisters were not symbols in that moment. They were daughters, sisters, and young women who had dreamed of ordinary futures, of love, of children, of a life beyond ceremony. Their deaths were not merely a political execution. They were the erasure of 4 bright, distinct souls whose only crime was being born into the wrong time. In the years that followed, myths and legends would surround their story. The most famous was the rumor that one of the sisters, often Anastasia, had survived. The idea of her escape captured the world's imagination. People needed to believe that at least one had been spared, that innocence could somehow endure. The countless impostors who later claimed her identity only proved how deeply that hope had rooted itself in the public mind. But the truth, revealed slowly through evidence and testimony, was both simpler and more heartbreaking. None of them survived. Their lives had ended together, just as they had lived together. The world's fascination with the Romanov tragedy has often focused on mystery and grandeur, but what endures most deeply is the humanity of their story. The sisters were not merely princesses. They were young women with fears, desires, and flaws. Olga, with her thoughtful nature, longed for peace and meaning. Tatiana, with her discipline, wanted a life of purpose. Maria dreamed of marriage and children. Anastasia sought freedom and laughter. Their dreams were modest, almost painfully ordinary. It is this ordinariness that makes their loss so devastating. As history moved on, their story became a symbol of lost innocence and the fragility of civilization. Their names faded for a time beneath the weight of new wars and new regimes, but the truth of who they were slowly reemerged through letters, photographs, and the memories of those who had known them. Each image, each word written in their diaries, brings them back to life, not as distant figures in jeweled tiaras, but as people who felt and feared as we do. Their kindness, their loyalty to one another, and their courage in the face of death remind us that history is not just the story of rulers and revolutions, but of individuals whose hearts beat beneath the machinery of events. Their legacy lies not in the empire they represented, but in the humanity they revealed. They faced humiliation, confinement, and death without surrendering to hatred. In their final letters, there is no anger, only gentleness and faith. They worried about their servants, asked after their guards' families, and expressed gratitude for small mercies. Their compassion endured even as the world denied them justice. That quiet grace, preserved through time, continues to move those who learn their story. In later decades, when the truth of their deaths was finally confirmed, the discovery brought not only closure but reflection. The remains were identified, their burial place sanctified, and their memory honored. Yet even with the facts laid bare, the emotional weight of their story remained untouched. The Romanov sisters had become more than victims of history. They had become symbols of what is most human: love, faith, and resilience. Their lives remind us that behind every great historical event are people whose personal stories often go untold. It is easy to speak of revolutions, wars, and politics in terms of power and ideology, but in the end, history is lived through human hearts. The Romanov sisters were caught between two worlds, the old order and the new, and they paid with their lives for a struggle they never chose. They did not fight battles or shape policy. Their only role was to endure. Yet in that endurance, they revealed something profound: the capacity of the human spirit to remain kind even when surrounded by cruelty. In the years since, countless books, films, and legends have sought to capture their story. Some have romanticized it, others have turned it into myth. But beyond the embellishments, what remains true is their humanity. The photographs of them, standing close together with shy smiles, are a reminder that they were real. They lived, they loved, and they died together. Their story does not belong only to Russia or to royalty. It belongs to all who understand loss, courage, and the longing for peace. The Romanov sisters' lives, taken so young, continue to echo not because of their titles but because of their hearts. They remind us that history's most powerful lessons often come from those who had no power at all. Their names, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, are spoken today not as relics of a fallen empire, but as symbols of compassion that survived even the worst of human cruelty. Their story ends in tragedy, but their legacy endures in the quiet strength of their example. They showed that dignity can exist even in despair, that love can outlast fear, and that kindness, once given, never truly dies. Long after the empire crumbled and the politics faded, the memory of the Romanov sisters continues to live, softly, gently, as if carried by the same whispering laughter that once filled their palace halls. They were 4 young women who faced the end of their world with grace, and in doing so, they left behind not just sorrow, but a light that still shines through the pages of history.